They say to not judge a book by its cover, but what about a video game? Box art has been a unique selling point for many years, and one of the most important aspects has always been the logo. This helps to instill a sense of identity, and although in recent times the logos we've received for games have been a lot more bland than they were maybe 20 years ago, they still do a good job of conveying what the game or franchise is all about. Final Fantasy has always been quite unique in this regard. Each game has its own logo, and almost every aspect is purposeful. Going beyond just conveying the tone of each game, many also tell their own story, having a close affinity with the game's plot, and such is the intricacy that even small details may be revealing. Some logos have also changed over time, further adding to the intrigue, and the first Final Fantasy serves as the perfect example, as it has featured 5 different packaged logos over the years, each with their own backstory and meaning. But before we talk more about that, I'd just like to give a shout out to Abyss Des, one of our top tier Patreon supporters, who suggested that we make this video. For the Japanese release, the name Final Fantasy was blazed over the box art, appearing in full 3D katakana. It did so with purposeful jagged edges and fragments splintering off, and its colour was a shimmering translucent blue. These elements combined to focus around a central theme of the game, crystals. The logo was accompanied by an elaborate piece of artwork provided by Yoshitaka Amano. It represented one of the Warriors of Light, and to be more precise, it represented the Warrior class. This may not be immediately obvious from the final version, but in a prior iteration, Amano coloured the warrior in red instead of blue, and it's likely that this prior version was used for his initial reference before he then decided to change the colour and add in some more details. The background also featured a dragon, quite possibly a nod to Bahamut, and Princess Sarah, a pivotal character whose kidnapping initiated the quest and whose rescue continued it. For the North American release, the marketing team decided to start from scratch, using a different font and a different colour. The box art also featured none of Amano's artwork, as the team instead opted for a more generic fantasy feel. This was typical of the times, and many other Japanese games like The Legend of Zelda and Super Mario had their box arts altered in a similar manner. When Final Fantasy was then re-released in Japan 2 years later, the logo was adjusted. It ditched the embellished crystal themes but did retain the blue colouring. The Amano artwork was also cropped to make it work with the different aspect ratio of the MSX packaging. It wasn't until the year 2000 though, when Final Fantasy released on the Wonderswan colour, that we would see what is now considered to be the standard logo for the original game. Adjusting to recent aesthetic decisions taken by the branding team, this saw the logo incorporate the now quintessential Final Fantasy font in English with a katakana positioned below. The warrior concept from the original box art was then placed between the two words, featuring a blue gradient. This logo then appeared in the West for the Final Fantasy Origins release, but for the 20th anniversary of the original Final Fantasy, Amano drew a new version of the Warrior of Light to distinguish this particular release from the others, even going so far as to reverse the blue gradient. Square Enix also released a standalone alternative logo that was much larger, but less in keeping with the typical visual style, and over the years, it has seldom been used. Final Fantasy II released right in the middle of Final Fantasy I releasing on the NES and the MSX, but its logo bore no relation to either of them. Instead of keeping with the crystalline theme or the flat gradient with a simple font, both of which were in katakana, the marketing team instead opted to use heavily stylized English, with the writing resembling a dragon, its head adorning the F in Final. The gradient remained, but its colour was changed to purple, with blue instead being used for the Roman numeral. Accompanying the logo on the Japanese box art was another piece of Amano artwork, this time in relation to Firion, the game's main protagonist, and he was seen wielding the blood sword, perhaps alluding to its hidden power. Final Fantasy II was planned to release in North America a few years later as Final Fantasy II Dark Shadow over Palakia. It would have featured new branding, which would have then been replicated on the upcoming releases of the Final Fantasy Legend II and Final Fantasy III. But as Final Fantasy II's release was scrapped, so was the rebrand. As with the original Final Fantasy II saw its logo updated for its release on the Wonderswan colour in 2001, but its revised logo had only a slight relation to the previous one, as Firion was removed and replaced by Emperor Palamisia. This referenced a piece of promotional artwork that Amano had created for the original NES release, and keeping with the same style employed with Final Fantasy I, it had a monochromatic gradient. Except instead of using blue, it used a pink gradient, as the colour was associated with the Emperor due to the pink crystals that adorned Pandemonium. The logo was then updated 6 years later for the 20th anniversary release of the game. This saw Amano create a new piece of artwork that was much more bold, and it gave the Emperor more real estate on the box while still making him the central figure. Amano also produced an alternative logo that was much bolder than the one he had created for Final Fantasy I. Following the release of Final Fantasy II, Square started to realise they had something, and when Final Fantasy III released, they decided to stick with the same logo, making it a bit cleaner. The Roman numerals were also made crystalline, a reference again to the central theme of crystals. As had been the case with the 2 previous games, the logo was accompanied by a lavish piece of Amano artwork, and much like the first game, it again featured a Warrior of Light. This time, the Warrior of Light was dual wielding, a mechanic introduced with the previous game that carried over, and they were seen wielding the Blood Sword along with what looks like the Ancient Sword. Final Fantasy III then stayed untouched until it was remade for the DS in 2006. But instead of choosing to commission a brand new logo, the decision was taken to reuse the original piece of Amano artwork. This was neatened up and given an emerald gradient, perhaps due to the game's association with wind, and it was changed to represent Luneth, one of the game's new protagonists, as opposed to a nameless Warrior of Light. As Final Fantasy jumped into the 16-bit era, there were wholesale changes. We saw evolved storytelling, evolved gameplay mechanics, and evolved branding. Final Fantasy IV was when the logo star we've all come to know and love was born. It was much more mature and sophisticated compared to what we had seen with Final Fantasy II and III, featuring a clean font and a subtle piece of artwork that complemented the English lettering. The object of this art was Kain Highwind, whose purple dragoon armour also influenced the logo's colouring. He was neither the main protagonist nor the main antagonist, but Kain was central to the plot, and it could be argued that his redemption arc was much stronger than Cecil's. What's also curious about this specific box art is that it referenced the Final Fantasy I and II re-release, using chibi versions of the main cast drawn by Kazuko Shibuya instead of the larger piece of Amano artwork. And that's why Cecil was red, as in Shibuya's earlier concepts, the Paladin was initially meant to be coloured as a throwback to the Warrior and Knight from Final Fantasy I and III respectively. When Final Fantasy IV released in North America, Squaresoft again wanted to use the opportunity to rebrand the franchise. This time, they went for stylized gold writing, with a sword taking the place of the letter T, and this appeared in front of a solid red background. For its release in Japan on the WonderSwan color, the logo remained almost the same as the original, with only tweaks made to bring it more in line with more recent releases. This saw the blanket's solid purple tone removed, with the font now black, and a bluey-purple gradient added to Kain, and it was very similar for its release as Final Fantasy IV Advance. But when Final Fantasy IV was remade for the DS, the decision was made to change the logo. This saw Kain removed, with the focus instead placed on a new piece of Amano artwork that featured Cecil, Kain, Edge, Rosa, and Rydia. It was an unorthodox approach, and it wasn't replicated outside of Japan. Instead, a new logo was created based on a brand new illustration Amano had made. This returned to the deep purple colour, although it did fade into a light blue, and it placed Golbez as the central focus, as well, it could be argued that his redemption arc was even stronger than Kain's. For its sequel, The After Years, a more modern logo was adopted. Instead of using a character as its central focus, it featured 2 important locations that were pivotal to the game's plot and had a strong association with its ending. And you can see from the design that there is a clear allusion to moons. When the game initially launched on iMode devices, the logo was given a blue to purple gradient as an ode to the original's colour association, but when the 3D remake released, its logo was changed and the vibrant red was added to the existing gradient. Final Fantasy V built upon the established norm when it was released in 1992 by using a blue font and introducing a gradient on the supporting imagery, which was purple. It was also a bit more progressive, as for the first time the imagery wasn't focused on one of the playable cast or someone who opposed them. Instead, it represented a wind drake. These were an endangered species used by the party to traverse the world, and one wind drake in particular, Hiryu, was pretty important to the story. The logo was also quite different from Final Fantasy IV, as the wind drake also interacted with the writing, wrapping its tail around the A in fantasy. Alongside this logo, artwork was again provided by Shibuya, with Bartz and Boko featuring. Final Fantasy V was then re-released on the PlayStation in Japan and on the Game Boy Advance, but although the supporting imagery changed each and every time, the logo remained intact throughout. Final Fantasy VI then burst onto the scene with a vibrant and expressive logo. For the first time, it featured a pure black font, and the use of blue, green or purple was replaced by a crimson-red gradient that faded into black. It was modelled around Tara Branford, the character who many consider to be the game's main protagonist. It featured her riding the Magitech armour, which interacted with the writing, and this served as a reference to the game's opening scene that saw an enslaved Tara visit Narshe alongside Biggs and Wedge in order to obtain an Esper. Unlike the two previous games, the box art saw a return to Amano's artwork, and it was more lavish than ever before. It mirrored the logo, featuring Tara atop her Magitech armour as she stood before Vector. In North America, Final Fantasy VI was rebranded to Final Fantasy III, and it continued the use of the same branding as the previous iteration, stylized gold writing with a sword taking the place of the letter T. This time, however, it deviated from the norm and used a textured background as opposed to solid colour, and this tied in with the game's advertising campaign, which featured Mog disposing of numerous enemies. With Final Fantasy now cemented as a staple video game franchise in Japan, and with its branding solidified, the logo of Final Fantasy VII was made a bit more adventurous. Due to its significance, it was decided that instead of featuring a character as they had done so many times before, the logo would instead be focused around a major plot event, the summoning of Meteor by Sephiroth and the impending doom it represented. Amano did countless concepts of what the Meteor should look like, and this extended to its size, positioning and colour. In the end, they settled on one of the larger variants, and it would be coloured with a green and blue tone to represent both Mako energy and the Lifestream. One small detail was also added that did not appear in any of Amano's concepts, a small circle just above Meteor that looks an awful lot like materia, perhaps representing the black materia. As the compilation of Final Fantasy VII expanded, the concept for the logo was also further explored, but the first game to be released deviated from tradition and featured a logo drawn by Tetsuya Nomura. Before Crisis released in 2004, and it featured 2 of the 11 playable characters, Rod and Gun. This was a curious choice, as these 2 characters have no particular importance to the story in relation to the others, but perhaps they were just Nomura's favourites. Advent Children was then the next property to be released, and this featured an evolved version of the original logo. Meteor was repurposed to show Midgar as a shell of its former self, and codes were placed throughout, highlighting the genetic disease, geostigma, that was plaguing the land. The materia was also changed to represent what looks like a flower, perhaps a nod to Geostigma's cure. Last Order was then released alongside Advent Children, but it featured a muted logo, and Crisis Core followed a similar artistic direction when it launched in 2007. Dirge Cerberus, which released between the two, featured a more ambitious logo, as it was a visual representation of Vincent's gun, the Cerberus. The most recent logo, used for the Final Fantasy VII Remake, was very similar to the original, but it was made 3D and featured a much darker tone, an intentional choice to represent that this game will have a much different vibe than the original. Final Fantasy VIII reverted back to featuring the playable cast, but it upped the ante by featuring 2 characters, Squall Leonhart and Rinoa Harteley. It also featured them in a way that would lead players to expect something, that they would have a close relationship, something not immediately clear during their initial interactions. As the scenario developed, the team knew a lot of focus would be placed around the moment that Squall realised that he cared for Rinoa. This would see them have an endearing moment aboard the Ragnarok, but it wouldn't be until they landed that Squall would realise how much Rinoa meant to him. This led to him taking a big risk, freeing Rinoa from her shackles at the Sorceress Memorial, and afterwards they embraced. At the request of the development team, Amano used this moment as a point of reference for the logo, and after numerous revisions, he landed on a design that everyone was happy with. It's well known that Final Fantasy IX was developed with the notion of returning the franchise back to its roots. This permeated throughout all aspects of development, affecting ways of working and also the story they wanted to tell. Central to this were crystals. In the earlier days of the franchise, crystals were ingrained in almost every story, with the Warriors of Light undergoing a quest to restore them and save the world. As the franchise evolved, that story mechanic became a bit laboured, but Final Fantasy IX reintroduced crystals in a more subtle manner, and it was the impending death of the Terran crystal that initiated everything that unfolded. It meant the logo had multiple meanings. In one sense, it was a graphical representation of the franchise's return to roots, and in another, it represented the spawning of life, as within the context of Final Fantasy IX's lore, life was born of the crystals. For its arrival on the PlayStation 2, Final Fantasy made bold strides when it came to production. Incredible FMV sequences were created, the soundtrack featured much better samples, and it even featured voice acting. But it also featured one of the largest and most grandiose logos the franchise had ever seen. Often, the focal point of the logo would be an image placed between the words Final and Fantasy, or at least it would be central to the words in general. It would also feature a bit of vertical depth, but it was never wider than the wording, until Final Fantasy X. Even with earlier concepts of the logo, such as this one which still had Yuna as the focal point, it's clear that it was always planned to be a sizable graphical asset. And for the final vision, we got to see a magical recreation of Yuna's somber sending that took place after Sin's decimation of Kilika. It was impactful, as this scene represented Yuna's strength and the important role someone has played in the world of Spira outside of just attempting to defeat Sin. But after learning the truth, Yuna would have looked back at moments like this with a lot of reflection. The logo for its sequel was a bit more blatant in terms of its application, highlighting the game's 3 protagonists in the midst of some action, Yuna even doing a dodge roll while firing her gun. It looks pretty cool, but the most interesting aspect of the logo was its colour scheme. This was identical to the original, but the gradient was reversed, something that allowed them to be joined up to create a combined logo with a distinct beginning and an end. The next entry was Final Fantasy XI, and this was a much different experience. With Square keen to broaden their horizons, they decided to take Final Fantasy online, and even though they had limited experience, Final Fantasy XI was a solid entry into the genre. Its logo represented the scale of the experience, and in a unique twist, the graphical asset appeared above the Final Fantasy writing as opposed to intersecting it. The logo itself featured numerous warriors from the 5 playable races as they banded together to try and fight back against the Beastmen tribes, and this was fitting as thousands upon thousands of players would fill each server. After many years of Yoshinori Kitase and Hironobu Sakaguchi leading the direction of Final Fantasy XII represented a significant shift as Yasumi Matsuno was appointed as director alongside Hiroyuki Ito. It led to a whole new style of Final Fantasy game being created, and its logo followed suit. Judge Gabranth was the central figure, highlighting how important his role was within the story, and it served as something of a throwback to Final Fantasy IV's logo, where Kain featured due to his redemption arc. The specific pose was a reference to his fight in the Sky Fortress Bahamut, which would end up being pivotal to Gabranth's character progression. Due to the judge's imposing armor and physique, it made the logo of Final Fantasy XII quite striking. Amino made it even more so by having it so tall in comparison to everything else we'd seen before, but what's interesting is that it wasn't even the planned logo. Amino was waiting to submit numerous concepts, but while he was waiting for the representative from Square Enix to come and pick up his drafts, he drew another piece in just under an hour. It was this logo that ended up being chosen, and the team even decided to keep in Amino's spontaneous brushstroke. The theme of much larger logos continued with Final Fantasy XIII, but unlike many prior games, it housed very intricate plot details and even influenced the game as opposed to being designed around an existing concept. Acting as a bold reference to the game's finale, the logo featured Cocoon, Fang, Vanille, and the legendary Pulse Lassie Ragnarok that they transformed into in order to create the Crystal Pillar and save Cocoon. But instead of featuring the Crystal Pillar, the logo instead turned into Sarah's pendant, a reference to her overarching importance. It made the logo quite striking, but what's interesting is that the design Amino came up with then influenced the game's ending, as the designers recreated Amino's artwork within the FMV sequence as opposed to it happening the other way around. For its sequel, it was decided that Lightning should be shown squaring off against her fated rival, Caius Ballard, the first time a protagonist and antagonist had featured in the logo. The colours were also intentional, as they mirrored the in-game representations of Caius, who was associated with the colour purple, and Lightning and Sarah, who were represented by the colour pink. Lightning Returns then rewrote the rulebook, ditching the traditional Final Fantasy font and the typical gradient colouring by having a more modern-looking logo. Gitade noted that he felt it was necessary, as they wanted people to appreciate the newness of Lightning Returns compared to everything that had come before. As with the previous MMO, the logo of Final Fantasy XIV was designed to represent a much larger group of characters coming together. It again featured the numerous races that players could play as, and they were positioned in a circular formation to show that they needed to rely on each other for support. There were also 14 characters, referencing the game's position in the main numbered series. For the game's relaunch as A Realm Reborn, the logo remained much the same, but its colour scheme was adjusted to crystalline blue, a reference to it being reborn. This also helped to place a focus on the new subtitle and the appearance of Meteor within the text. Now, it's pretty common knowledge that Final Fantasy XV had a rather tumultuous development cycle, and this led to some interesting changes to its logo. When it was first unveiled as Final Fantasy Versus 13, its logo was designed to have contrasting colours to that of Final Fantasy 13, as they were meant to be in the same shared mythology. It featured a sleeping woman, most likely Etro, with a blue orb behind her, and it also featured a shut eye as a nod to the song Somnus. After its rebrand to Final Fantasy XV, the graphical asset was retained, but it was given an even darker tone. The blue orb lost its colour, and the sleeping woman was changed to be the Oracle, Luna Freya Nox Fleury. Upon completing the game, the player would then see the game's true logo revealed. This featured a sleeping Noctis in his royal attire to tie in with the game's ending. And that brings us onto Final Fantasy XVI, the next major installment. At the moment we don't know, well, anything much about the story, but we can assume that Phoenix and Ifrit, both icons associated with the Fire Crystal, will be central to the plot. As such, they both appear in the game's logo, with Phoenix adopting a fiery colour and Ifrit adopting a much darker one, suggesting that it's a nefarious party. And with that, I think we're done. We've covered a lot of logos throughout this video, and we hope you found the explanations very insightful. Let us know in the comments below which logo has been your favourite, and if you enjoyed the video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. I'd also like to thank again Abyss Des for the recommendation to create the video. If you'd like to have a video created in a similar manner, feel free to head over to Patreon to find out more. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. A big thanks to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, and of course a big thanks to all of you for watching this video. I hope to see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.